The champagne was still cold when I heard my son's future wife say she didn't love him. I had stepped away from the rehearsal dinner to use the men's room, the kind of old restored inn outside Asheville, where the hallways are narrow and the walls are thick stone that hold every sound like a secret. I was rounding the corner past the coat room when I heard her voice coming from behind the half-open door. Soft, deliberate. The way people talk when they think no one is listening. 3 more weeks, she said. Then it's done. Then I'm out. I stopped. Don't call this number again until after the wedding. I told you. He doesn't check anything. He just trusts me. It's almost sad. She laughed. It was a small, private laugh. Nothing like the warm and musical laugh she used at the dinner table. The one that made my son look at her like she'd hung every star in the sky herself. This laugh had no warmth in it at all. I stood in that hallway for a long moment after she went quiet. I heard the click of her phone, the rustle of her dress, and then she walked out of the coat room and nearly ran directly into me. And her face did something complicated in the half-second before she arranged it back into a smile. "George," she said, touching my arm. "There you are. Daniel's been looking for you." I smiled back. I told her I'd been admiring the stonework in the hallway, and I walked back to the dinner table where my son was laughing with his friends, his whole face open and easy the way it had been since he was 7 years old and the world hadn't given him any reason not to trust it yet. I picked up my glass. I watched her settle back into the chair beside him, tuck her hand into his arm, lean her head briefly against his shoulder, and I understood, in the way you sometimes understand things before your mind has finished forming the thought, that something was very wrong. My son and I had always been close. After his mother and I divorced amicably, carefully, when Daniel was in his 20s and old enough that it didn't break anything, I moved from Charlotte up to Asheville to be near my sister. And Daniel would drive up on weekends, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. He was the kind of man who called on Sundays, who remembered your opinions about things and brought them up again months later. I was proud of him in the deep, quiet way that doesn't need to say itself out loud. When he told me about her 8 months before the rehearsal dinner, standing in my kitchen, his voice had a different quality than I'd heard before. Like something had been added to it. He showed me a photo on his phone. A woman with dark hair and careful eyes and a smile that knew exactly what it was doing. He said her name was Vanessa. He said he'd met her at a conference in Raleigh. He said he'd never felt this way before. I said all the right things. I asked the right questions. And when I met her for the first time at a dinner in Charlotte, she was perfectly charming, attentive. She asked about my work, my life, the years I'd spent building houses across western North Carolina. She remembered details from one conversation to the next. She had the kind of intelligence that makes people feel seen, but she had almost no past. That was the thing I kept snagging on, the small thread I couldn't stop pulling. She'd grown up in Tucson, she said. Her parents had both passed. She'd worked in corporate consulting and relocated several times. She had a few friends she mentioned, but never introduced. A previous relationship she described only as not good, and then closed the door on completely. When I asked questions that went more than one layer deep, she answered the surface and redirected. She was extraordinarily good at redirecting. I told myself I was being a suspicious old man. I told myself I was projecting. My son was 34 years old, and he was not a fool. I had raised him to be careful, to think clearly, to pay attention to what people did, and not just what they said. And he was happy, genuinely, visibly happy in a way I hadn't seen from him in years. I kept my mouth shut, right up until the rehearsal dinner. After I heard her in that coat room, I lay awake in my room at the inn for most of the night. I turned what I'd heard over and over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the innocent explanation. Maybe it had been a work call. Maybe "then I'm out" had referred to a job, a contract, a lease. Maybe I had misread the laugh. But I kept coming back to the way her face had moved when she saw me in the hallway. That quarter second of something cold before the warmth was switched back on. I had spent 40 years in the contracting business, which means I had spent 40 years reading people, reading whether a handshake meant what it claimed to mean, reading whether a smile was the kind that held or the kind that folded. That cold flash hadn't been surprise. It had been calculation. I drove back to Asheville the next morning before breakfast. I told my son I wasn't feeling well. He walked me to my truck and hugged me and told me to get some rest. And I held on to that hug a second longer than I usually would. I had 3 weeks. The first person I called was a man named Walt Drury, who had spent 22 years with the Charlotte Police Department before retiring and setting up a private investigative practice. He had done some work for me years ago, a business matter. Nothing dramatic, and I trusted him the way you trust someone who has shown you exactly who they are under pressure. I drove down to Charlotte and sat across from him in his office and told him everything I'd heard, exactly as I'd heard it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "What's her full name?" he asked. "Vanessa Lee Cook," I said. "That's what Daniel has. That's what's on the wedding invitations." "Date of birth?" "March of 1991. Daniel showed me her driver's license once when they were filling out a lease application together. I remembered it. Walt wrote it down. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He didn't reassure me the way people do when they're not taking you seriously. He just said he'd start pulling threads and call me when he had something. That was the only reassurance I needed. It took him 11 days. I was sitting on my back porch when my phone rang. It was just after 7 in the evening, and the light was doing that thing it does in Asheville in late October, going orange and sideways through the trees, and I remember thinking that whatever Walt was about to tell me was going to change the way I remembered that particular light for the rest of my life. "George," he said, "you need to come down to Charlotte. Bring a notepad." I drove down that night. Walt had laid everything out across his conference table in neat printed sections. He had the methodical quality of a man who had delivered difficult information many times and understood that the delivery mattered as much as the content. He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from me and started from the beginning. There was no Vanessa Lee Cook from Tucson, Arizona. There was no record of that name attached to a social security number, a birth certificate, a school enrollment, or a tax return that predated 6 years ago. 6 years ago, a woman named Sandra Marie Pruitt, born in Biloxi, Mississippi in 1989, had begun building a secondary identity through a combination of purchased documents and carefully constructed digital history. Sandra Pruitt had been married twice. The first marriage, in 2016, was to a software executive in Austin, Texas. That marriage had lasted 14 months. The divorce settlement had transferred a significant amount of liquid assets into an account in her name, after which the account had been dissolved and the money moved through a series of transfers that Walt's contact at a financial crimes unit had described as textbook layering. The second marriage was in 2019, to a retired physician in Scottsdale, Arizona. That marriage had lasted 11 months. Same pattern. Similar outcome. There were fraud charges filed in Maricopa County following the second marriage. But by the time the paperwork had progressed, Sandra Pruitt had ceased to exist, and Vanessa Cook had begun. Walt slid a photograph across the table. It was a DMV photo from the Texas marriage. Low resolution, but clear enough. Dark hair. Then, the same careful eyes. I sat with that for a moment. "She's not divorced from the second husband," Walt said quietly. "Technically, she's still legally married to the physician in Scottsdale, which means your son's wedding, if it proceeds, won't be legally valid. But that's probably the least of his problems." I thought about my son driving up to Asheville on Sunday afternoons. I thought about the way his voice had sounded different when he told me about her, like something had been added to it. I thought about how you protect a person from information that is going to hurt them no matter how carefully you deliver it. "How do I tell him?" I asked. Walt looked at me steadily. "That's not the part I can help with," he said. "But I'll tell you this. You can tell him everything I just told you, and show him every document on this table, and if he's far enough gone, he won't believe you. She'll have an explanation for all of it. She'll cry. She'll make him feel like he's choosing between her and you. And you might lose him for a while, before you get him back." He paused. "Or you can let the paperwork do the talking." He explained what he meant. He had already called an attorney he worked with regularly, a woman named Caroline who specialized in asset protection and family law. The 3 of us met the following morning. My son had inherited money when his grandfather died 4 years prior. Not an enormous sum, but meaningful investments and a piece of land outside Hendersonville that had appreciated considerably. Everything Walt had found suggested that this was what she was after. Daniel wasn't flashy about money, but he also wasn't careful about hiding it from someone he trusted completely. Caroline's suggestion was precise and, once she explained it, felt almost elegant in its simplicity. I would tell my son that I wanted to restructure my own estate planning before the wedding. Nothing alarming, just an old man being responsible. As part of that, I wanted the family attorney to conduct standard identity verification on all parties who would be named in any updated documents. This was entirely normal. This was the kind of thing careful families did. I would present it not as suspicion, but as process. The identity verification would require Vanessa Lee Cook to submit documentation, original birth certificate, social security card, state-issued identification to Caroline's office for standard notarized review. There was no Vanessa Lee Cook. There were no valid documents for a person who didn't exist. She'll either produce fraudulent documents, Caroline said, in which case we have a clear federal crime and we go from there. Or she'll balk. She'll manufacture a reason to refuse or delay. And at that point, you show your son what Walt found, and the refusal is its own answer. I asked what happened if she ran. Caroline looked at me calmly over her reading glasses. Then your son is saved a great deal of pain and a significant amount of money, and you accept that he might be angry with you for a period of time, and you wait for him to come around. I drove back to Asheville and sat with all of it for 2 days. The hardest part, the part I hadn't fully anticipated, was that I couldn't tell anyone. Not my sister. Not Daniel's mother, who had called me twice in the past week because she thought something seemed off with the wedding preparations and wanted to compare notes. I told her I was fine. Everything was fine. Let's talk after the wedding. I felt the dishonesty of that even as I knew the alternative was worse. And I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about who he was going to be on the other side of this. However it ended. About whether the man who had called me every Sunday and driven up on weekends to sit on a porch was going to be able to put himself back together after learning that the thing he'd built his happiness on for 8 months had been a WS performance. That the laugh he'd loved, the intelligence he'd admired, the warmth he'd believed in all of it, had been a tool aimed directly at him. I had spent my whole adult life building things that were meant to last. Houses, mostly. Structures designed to hold weight, to withstand weather, to outlast the people who built them. I had never built anything that mattered more than the relationship I had with my son. And now I was going to do the thing that might damage it, because not doing it would damage him more, and some calculations don't require a lot of thought even when they cost everything. I called my son on a Tuesday. I told him that my attorney had advised me to update my estate documents before the wedding, that it was just responsible planning, nothing to worry about, but that Caroline's office would need to conduct standard identity verification on Vanessa as part of the update since she would be named in certain documents going forward. I kept my voice easy. I said I hoped it wasn't any trouble. There was a brief silence. "Sure, Dad," Daniel said. "She won't mind. She'll want to do whatever makes you comfortable." That phrase stayed with me. She'll want to do whatever makes you comfortable. I wondered if she'd told him to say exactly that. Somewhere along the way, I wondered if it had become his own thought by now, if that's how it worked. The request went through Caroline's office officially, with a formal letter sent to Vanessa's email address and a copy mailed to my son's apartment. Caroline's paralegal followed up 2 days later. Vanessa had responded politely, Caroline said, almost warmly, that she was in the middle of relocating some of her personal storage from a unit in Raleigh and would need a few extra days to locate the originals. Walt called me that afternoon. "She's stalling," he said. "She's trying to figure out if she can forge something convincing enough, or if she needs to build an exit. How long do we give her? She's got a week before the wedding. If she hasn't produced anything in 5 days, I'd say the decision's been made for you." On the 4th day, Daniel called me. He didn't call on a Sunday morning the way he usually did. He called at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, and when I answered, I could tell from the first syllable that something had collapsed. "Dad," he said, "she's gone." I sat down. He told me in a measured, careful voice that was clearly costing him something to maintain that he had come home from work that evening to find her gone. Not temporarily gone. Gone in the way that means someone has made a decision. Closet cleared. Overnight bag missing. A note on the kitchen counter that said only that she was sorry and that he deserved better. No phone call. No explanation. The tracking on her phone showed it had been turned off somewhere on I-85 heading south. "Do you know what's happening?" he asked. And the way he asked it told me he already suspected I did. I told him everything. I drove to Charlotte that night. I sat across from my son at his kitchen table with Walt's printed documents between us, and I went through all of it. Sandra Pruitt, the marriages in Texas and Arizona, the fraud charges, the fabricated identity. What I had overheard in the hallway at the inn. I watched his face move through things I didn't have names for. He didn't interrupt. He didn't push back. He just sat there and received it the way you receive something when part of you already knew. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. At the rehearsal dinner, he finally said, "You heard her, and you didn't say anything." "I didn't have proof yet," I said. "And I knew that without proof, you would have had to choose between me and her. I didn't want to put you in that position." He looked at the documents on the table. He picked up the DMV photo from Texas and held it for a moment and set it back down. "You could have told me," he said. "Yes," I said. "I could have. And I'm sorry I didn't." He didn't answer that. We sat in his kitchen while the clock above the stove moved through midnight and into the early hours of Friday morning. And sometimes we talked and sometimes we didn't, and I let him lead it, because there was nothing else I could do for him except be there and let him lead it. Just before 2 in the morning, he said, "Was any of it real? Like, is it possible that she—" He stopped. He set his hands flat on the table. "Can someone fake all of it? All the time? Everything she said to me?" I thought about the woman in the coat room. The cold calculation in that fraction of a second before the warmth switched back on. The laugh with no warmth in it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know what was real and what wasn't. I'm not sure that's the most important thing right now." He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the parking lot of his apartment complex, at the ordinary Friday morning darkness of it. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet and it cost him something. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway." Walt had turned everything over to a contact at the FBI field office in Charlotte before the end of that week. The financial crimes angle, the identity fraud, the bigamy, it crossed enough jurisdictional lines to make it a federal matter. Sandra Pruitt was located in Savannah, Georgia, 11 days later. I don't know all the details of what followed because most of it moved through channels that didn't loop me in, and I didn't push for information. That was never the point. The wedding date passed on a Saturday in November. My son and I drove up to Asheville that weekend. We sat on my back porch the way we always had, coffee in the morning, bourbon in the evening. The mountains doing what they do in November, going gray and quiet and immovable. We didn't talk about her much. We talked about other things. His work, a project I was thinking about taking on in the spring. His mother, who had driven down from Knoxville and was relieved in the specific way that mothers are when a bullet has been dodged on behalf of someone they love. There was something different between my son and me now, and I want to be careful about describing it accurately. It was not a closeness that replaced what we'd had before. What we'd had before was already good, already something I was grateful for. It was more like a depth that had been added, the kind that only arrives when two people have been through something that required honesty and it held. On Sunday morning, I made eggs the way he'd liked them since he was a kid, scrambled but not too soft, with sharp cheddar and whatever hot sauce I had in the cabinet. He sat at the kitchen counter and ate them, and looked out at the mountains, and then looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "When you heard her at the rehearsal dinner, what did you feel?" I thought about that for a moment. The cold champagne, the narrow hallway, the laugh with nothing behind it. "Afraid," I said. "Mostly afraid." "Of what?" "Of being wrong," I said. "And of being right." He nodded like that made sense to him. "I keep thinking," he said, "about how I didn't see it. I'm not an idiot, Dad. I pay attention to things. And I didn't see it. She was good at what she did, I said. Better than most. That's not a reflection on your judgment. That's a reflection on how much practice she'd had. Still, I agreed. I didn't try to talk him out of whatever he was working through. That's the other thing about building things you learn early, that you can't rush the settling. You put the structure up correctly, and then you wait for it to find its own level. And if you've done it right, it holds. We did the dishes together after breakfast, the way we had when he was a teenager and it was just the two of us on weekends. Him washing and me drying, the radio on low. He handed me a mug and I dried it and put it back in the cabinet, and the mountains sat where they'd always been outside the window, gray and permanent and completely indifferent to all of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this ended. Something I haven't quite been able to put into words until now. People talk about protecting the people you love as though it's a dramatic thing, as though it looks like a confrontation or a declaration or a moment of visible courage. But most of it doesn't look like that. Most of it looks like lying awake in a room at an inn in Asheville, turning a half-heard conversation over in your mind until 4 in the morning. It looks like driving to Charlotte on a Wednesday night to sit across from a man with printed documents and 2 cups of coffee. It looks like keeping your voice steady on a phone call, when what you actually want to do is warn someone you love that the ground beneath them has been disappearing for months. It looks like patience. It looks like restraint. It looks like trusting that if you do it right carefully, methodically, without letting your own fear or anger make the decisions, the people you love will still be there on the other side of it. My son still calls on Sundays. He still drives up to Asheville when he wants to sit on a porch and talk. He's doing better than I expected, or maybe exactly as well as I expected, because I have always known who he was and what he was made of, and what he's made of holds up. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not the fraud, not the investigation, not the documents spread across a conference table, or the FBI field office, or any of it. The thing I keep coming back to is my son handing me a mug on a Sunday morning in November, the radio on low, the mountains out the window. That's what I was protecting. That's what held.